Well, we welcome you back to the second half of tonight's edition of Wednesday Night with myself, Inayat Wadi, right here on Salam Media and its global political dynamics that we are talking about. We're talking about Venezuela in the United States of America. Now, looking at it from a South African perspective, South Africa has been highly critical of the United States for its recent actions against the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, and the abduction, the arrest of a sitting head of state, clearly undermining international law and the United Nations Charter. And South Africa, in its position, clearly outlined that the global significance of this crisis in Venezuela, and this is obviously setting a very, very dangerous precedent, and it could set obviously the problem with the apprehension and the kidnapping of Maduro, again violating Venezuela's sovereignty, but also weakening what is termed as the international-based, rules-based international order. And as a result, we are talking to a number of people this evening, and just to understand and debunking this myth of Venezuela in the United States, looking at both from a Venezuelan and a South African perspective. We're joined by my panelists this evening, Andreína Chávez, a Venezuelan journalist who is based in Caracas. We're talking with Tarik, Lalla, South African student leader, youth policy advocate, and also joining us from the researcher at the Benchmark Foundation, David van Wyk. To all our panelists, Andreína, to Tarik, and to David van Wyk, as you appear on screen, we welcome you to the show. Good evening to you. We thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Andreína, let's begin with you. And obviously, you are in the thick of things. You are in Venezuela as well. And as a journalist, you obviously have been following these developments very, very closely as well. And before we talk about debunking the myth of Venezuela from a South African perspective, just take us through what are some of the latest developments that are playing out in Venezuela right now. Andreína?
So hi everyone. Yes, hi everyone. I'm so sorry. My connection is not really good right now. I want to begin by saying that we have been experiencing some internet, Wi-Fi, and telecommunications issues because during the U.S. bombings on January 3rd, several antennas, communication antennas, and electrical power facilities were bombed by the United States. So we have been having some issues when it comes to connection since January 3rd. So as you were saying, I live in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. So I was here, I was woken up by the US bombings on January 3rd, like everybody else in the country. The first myth that I want to put to rest right now, it is that the US operation in Venezuela was surgical, that they only targeted military sites in Venezuela. That is not true. They actually caused a lot of destruction in civilian areas, civilian population. They targeted a building that is inhabited by elderly people in Capitamar, which is La Guaira state, north of Caracas. They killed at least one woman in that building, an 80-year-old woman, Rosa Gonzalez, was killed because of the US bombings. At least 8 apartments in that building were destroyed because of the bombing. We also have reports that a 45-year-old woman, a Colombian national that had been living in Venezuela for the past 10 years, was also killed during the bombings of an antenna communication near her house, which affected her house and it killed her. We also have so many other reports of people who lost their houses, people who were severely affected by the US bombings. So it's not true that this was only a bombing that was targeting military sites in Venezuela. I think that is one of the first things that I want to make sure that everybody knows. And second, it is important to understand that the United States claims that what they did in Venezuela was a law enforcement operation, and they claim that they were using their own national laws to enter Venezuela, invade Venezuela, and kidnapped President Maduro and his wife Silvia Flores. That is not true. The United States does not have jurisdiction to go to any country in the world and just kidnap their president and their first lady. The United States cannot apply its own national laws to any other country in the world. Venezuela is a sovereign country. We are a sovereign country that had a sitting head of state that was in functions when the United States kidnapped President Maduro. And that is the second thing that people need to know: that President Maduro, he was not arrested, he was not detained, he was kidnapped by the United States government with the purpose, as we now know, to be able to control Venezuela, to be able to make decisions from Washington about Venezuela's future, and specifically about Venezuela's oil exports. We all know that the United States has been always trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government because it wants complete control of Venezuela's oil industry, which has the largest industry, the largest oil reserves in the world. And now we know that. Now we have President Trump openly admitting that everything that happened in Venezuela had nothing to do with drug trafficking, had nothing to do with criminal activity. It had all to do with the fact that the United States wants to be able to run Venezuela from Washington.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Andreína. David, let's bring you into the discussion. And obviously, as Andreína mentioned, it's no hidden secret where Donald Trump has obviously made it very, very clear in terms of controlling Venezuela, imposing a U.S. monopoly, or by selling its oil to the rest of the world. And, he's laid down many a condition. And, we can call it what we want to. We can even call it an armed robbery of Venezuela, which in fact is the case as well. And just your take, because now we've seen the South African statement that has come through. South Africa has reacted quite strongly in terms of what has actually been playing out. Just your thoughts, on how you see these developments evolving, and also some of the statements that are coming through from someone like Donald Trump.
Well, I think that we first of all must note that a day or so before the hostage taking of Maduro and his wife, Trump met with Netanyahu. And we see in this week disturbances in Iran, another oil-rich area. Now, you would ask yourself, why targeting Iran and Venezuela and their oil when the United States has an abundance of oil? Well, the reason for that is quite simple. They want to strangle the Chinese economy because they cannot countenance the fact that the Chinese economy is very rapidly outstripping the American economy. And the Chinese development model actually is a model which shows the world that a country can actually look after its citizens while developing itself technologically. It doesn't have to be development for a few plutocrats or a few billionaires in the country. It can be development for everybody, and everyone can benefit from the development. Venezuela tried to have a development model similar to say that the income generated from the oil from the country should actually benefit the people of the country and not just oligarchs. Now, so the first point to make is that this is actually part of the war against China. China doesn't make war necessarily on other countries. What China does is it expands its economy through trade and through business and so on. It's in stark contrast to the United States, which expands its influence in the world through the barrel of a gun. It's basically gangster economics. And this is not just the case with Trump, it's been the case for a very long time. And, Central and South America, being in very close proximity to the United States, have suffered the consequences of this gunboat, buccaneer, pirate type politics that the United States practices. The United States doesn't want to see other countries being independent. It doesn't want to see them. It wants them to be dependent on the dollar. It wants them to be dependent on U.S. trade. It wants them to succumb. It wants them to kneel before the United States as the big power in the world. And this takes us back to World War II, when the United States suffered relatively little in that particular war. There was no war on any territory of the United States except for Pearl Harbor. And what is more is that the United States came out of it unscathed, and it came out of it being the leading industrial power in the country, everyone else owed the United States an awful lot of money. Britain owed the United States money, Europe owed the United States money, and as repayment to the United States for having bought United States weapons to fight in the Second World War, many of these countries gave up territory, but they also paid huge amounts of money towards the United States, which even further then strengthened the US economy and made the dollar a dominant currency in the world. Now, what we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years is a shifting in the global economy towards China and towards the East. And this shift in the global economy was partially because the United States exported those jobs that Americans did not want to do. It exported those jobs to China. Europe exported those industries which are the most polluting industries to China. China said, well, okay, you can bring your industries here. We can provide the labor that you require, but we will at some point take control of the intellectual property, and we will then use that intellectual property towards our own development. And we will overcome the problems of pollution and so on associated with your dirty industries that you brought to China and with your cheap labor economics that you brought to China. We will overcome that. Now, the Chinese economy is a planned economy as compared to the economy of the United States. The United States economy is run by 5 or 6 oligarchs, very powerful individuals with lots and lots of money, who dominate, and there's absolutely no planning taking place, which is why the economy has become so chaotic, with problems of over expenditure, problems of unemployment, problems of infrastructure decay and collapse, and so on. And basically, the Trump administration is an attempt by the United States to retain its hegemony in a situation where the global hegemonic economic power is shifting towards China and away from the United States.
Yes, David, thank you very much for that. And let's bring Tarik into the discussion. Tarik, I think, there's just so much that you've heard from both from Andreína and from David as well. And we know that this has not just happened. This is by design, because we've seen the modus operandi from Donald Trump over a period of time. We've seen the economic strangulation of Venezuela take place, where he ordered a total and complete blockade as well. But also at the same time, as David mentioned as well, with Donald Trump in power, it's just about racketeering. And again, it's about Venezuelan oil, but also in terms of stemming its hegemony to many countries around the world. And we've heard that they may strike. A strike on Iran may also be imminent as well, where the US wants to replicate the Venezuelan model in Iran.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think the points I think are raised around the question of world hegemony. Effectively, I mean, what we're witnessing here, from how we can understand it, is the collapse of an empire, right? What we're seeing today, effectively, is the decline of an empire that has had global hegemony in a unipolar world, and with the sort of acts of desperation, as some may put it, we are sort of getting the perfect manifestation. I mean, look, one of the things that we have to be very clear about is that Donald Trump is not acting out of alignment with what is America's global geopolitical character. This is, I mean, anyone throughout the global south for the past 50 years will tell you that this is not something new. And as you've mentioned, I think the point here is quite simple, right? The playbook is very consistent, right? We were told weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We were told, Christian genocide in Nigeria. We were told white genocide in South Africa. And obviously within the context of Venezuela, we're told that somehow drugs are coming through Venezuela, when there is very little empirical evidence that supports the claim. But it's based on, I think, this character of the USA, which has basically been produced from a global world order that was unipolar in nature. And with the rise of BRICS, and I think the previous speaker had also mentioned, for example, China as another center of power. But I would even like to expand on that to say the rise of multipolarity, sort of multiple centers of power across the world, effectively as a much closer step to democratizing economic power. But to that extent, it poses a threat to the sort of American ruling class. The handful of people that control the American economy, the billionaires and the millionaires. It poses a threat because they've benefited for very, very many decades of impunity. And I think that then brings in the question of, I think, international law. And I mean, the one thing that I want to mention is that we know international law effectively died in Palestine, right? We know that that's the case because, you know, we had sanctions being placed on Russia. We had, you know, years and years of African leaders going to the ICC and the ICJ. But the moment it was a Western-backed leader, there was no case to be made until South Africa took the case there. And even till today, you know, we've seen very, very little accountability for leaders there. And so within that context, can we then be surprised that the US is acting so brazenly in its pursuit of stealing resources from across the world? I mean, Nigeria has oil, you know, sub-Saharan Africa is rich with natural minerals, precious metals, and obviously South America has oil as well. And I think that then ties in the whole question here, which is to say, effectively, are we surprised that the US is acting in the way that it's behaving, given that it's acted with impunity for the past 70 years, 70, 80 years since World War II. And that then brings us to this point where, or to the state that we're in, where the biggest threat to the unipolar hegemony is multipolarity. And so that is why then we ask ourselves, how is it possible that, how can we tie in Iran to Venezuela? How can we tie in Palestine to what's happening in Sudan or in Congo? It's the monopolization of resources to the benefit of the ruling class of the West. And that's where we are at this point in history.
Thanks for that, Tarik. And let's bring Andreína back into the. I see we've lost her for some reason or the other. She is trying to reconnect. I know there are issues with regards to connectivity by the sound of things. But David, I think let's just continue from your side. And it's interesting, you know, that you made extensive reference to China as well. And just to understand, and I know Tarik spoke a lot with regard to Africa, he's spoken about Nigeria as well. But let's just look at it from a global power perspective, because America obviously claims to be a superpower, China equally a superpower in its own right as well. And just to look at it from a Chinese perspective, how is this likely to impact global I see, sorry, David, I'm going to have to get a hold of Andreína. I see she's back with us again. Again, I think there seems to be a problem. We need to apologize for that. I see he is buffering. But David, let's just look at it from a Chinese perspective. How is this likely to impact on China?
Well, I think that the Chinese have been quietly building up their influence in the world through business and trade. You know, I do a lot of work in Africa, and I do a lot of work in the DRC and other African countries. And for more than 100 years of colonialism, many of these countries, like the airport in Lusaka, for example, was a Second World War airport until very recently, when the Chinese went in and they built a proper airport there. They built rail infrastructure, they built road infrastructure. There's never been a road between Kinshasa and Lubumbashi in the Congo, in the mineral-rich area of Katanga. The Chinese have now built that road, for example. In southern Angola, where South Africa absolutely destroyed the southern parts of Angola in Kwandu-Kubangu province and other areas, the Chinese went and fixed up all the roads, removed all the landmines, fixed the infrastructure, put back the electricity and things like that in that country. The Chinese have, through trade and through business, extended their influence very quietly all around the world. And in Venezuela, the Chinese moved in very big to support the oil sector in Venezuela. You know, creating the ports and infrastructure also in Panama and so on, with the aim of creating a global beneficial situation with regard to the immense wealth that has been created in China over the last 40, 50 years, because the Chinese economy has been growing consistently at almost 10% or more per annum for this entire period. And what, you know, every month we get Western news media saying, oh, the Chinese economy is going to collapse, at the end of China is coming soon, and so on. And basically they are perplexed by the fact that China is not collapsing. And the reason why China is not collapsing is because everything in China is planned. There are 5-year plans which are strictly adhered to, and which even the private sector have to abide by. So as the Chinese themselves say, billionaires in China are dictated to by the government. They don't dictate to the government. So in other words, they don't control the government, they are controlled by the government. And this is a very big difference from the United States, where in the United States, if we look at Trump's adventure in Venezuela, he openly stated that he wanted to get the oil industry back to United States companies. He said, oh, the Venezuelans stole American land, they stole American businesses, they stole American oil, which of course basically calls into question the sovereignty of Venezuela. Now, the Chinese trade in a very different way. They don't trade in a way that says, your country now belongs to us, your land now belongs to us, your resources now belong to us. They trade, they do business. They don't come and they don't plunder, which is the Western model, which is the colonial and new colonial model that we are all used to in the world, where the West dictates what we do and how we do it and why we do it and when we do it. And we don't really have any sovereignty. Our sovereignty basically is formalistic. It is a ritual of opening of parliament every year, but we don't own our economy. We don't own our resources. Just today, I asked the question, how much of our minerals go into the military-industrial complex in the United States that is used to produce the bullets that shoot people in Gaza or shoot people in Palestine? We have private companies in control of our minerals, and these private companies are selling to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder is often the arms industry. We can see the rise in the copper price recently as a result of the wars. Copper is used extensively in munitions manufacturing. We also see the rise in the gold price. People pay for the weapons and so on with gold. So basically, our weapons are being used to manufacture weapons that will ultimately be used against us in the global south, because that is when Trump wants to assert his role as the landlord of the planet. He will send in his army using weapons manufactured from the minerals and resources from the global south against the global south.
Yes, David, thank you. I see Andreína has joined us via telephone as well. Andreína, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay. All right, Andreína, in fact, my question to you was going to be with regards to Venezuela and the people of Venezuela as well, in terms of on the ground. What has the reactions been? We know that the president and his wife have made a court appearance already. Apparently, there's another appearance that is going to be taking place in March sometime as well. What is the situation on the ground right now as we speak?
Yes, certainly. So first, the country has been very calm. People have been at peace. Living conditions, the day-to-day life has come back to normal. And that is a form of resistance. That is what we have always said. Because when the U.S. bombed the country and they kidnapped President Maduro and his wife, they were hoping that there will be an implosion, that there will be a civil war in Venezuela. And that didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. So Venezuela is right now at calm. Everything is normal. Children are going back to school. People are going back to work. Every commercial is open. Every store is open. And that is a form of resistance. People are just making sure that everybody knows that Venezuela is at peace and that Venezuela doesn't want any kind of war. And second, we have, of course, all the Chavista base, all the popular power organizations, the social movement, the women movement, the youth movement. They are all rallying in the streets every single day since President Maduro was kidnapped. Since January 3rd, we have seen large, massive rallies, massive concentrations of popular power demanding that President Maduro is returned to Venezuela, demanding that the United States stop interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs, and denouncing this gross violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, both by the U.S. Military attacks on January 3rd, but also denouncing these neo-colonial plans that Trump has for Venezuela, in which he claims that his administration is going to decide the future of our country, and his administration is going to decide who and how and when do we sell oil to other countries in the world. And I think that is what's happening right now on the ground in Venezuela. What we're seeing is that people are claiming back their peace and normality, and at the same time, we're seeing popular power on the streets every single day, demanding that the United States stops this unilateral aggression against our country. And we also have to remember that people are not just denouncing the U.S. military attack and the kidnapping of the president. People are also denouncing that the United States has a naval blockade against Venezuela. Since December, the United States has a naval blockade on Venezuela, and it has been seizing, capturing oil tankers in the Caribbean, and then keeping the oil that belongs to Venezuela, oil that was sold by Venezuela to other countries. And we're also denouncing that the U.S. is trying to asphyxiate the economy. He's trying to cause starvation in the country. At the same time, people have been denouncing that the United States has killed more than 100 people in the Caribbean, people who were on small boats that the United States claims were trafficking drugs without any evidence, and more than 100 people were killed in the Caribbean. On top of that, we have the entire U.S. military poised in the Caribbean, threatening the entire region. And so these are all the things that people who have been on the streets have been denouncing. And of course, the main priority, both for the Venezuelan people and for acting President Delcy Rodriguez, it is for everybody to know that Venezuela still has a government. That is not true that the United States is running Venezuela. We have an entire government in place, headed by acting President Delcy Rodriguez, and we have an entire popular power that is also holding on to sovereignty. And that is what is happening right now on the ground in Venezuela.
Thank you. But also, Tarik, when one looks at it, one can actually look at this whole kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and his wife and Donald Trump and his statements as far as Venezuela is concerned. But one can take a look at it from many angles as well. And looking at it also from a global political or geopolitical perspective as well. We've known for a very, very long time that U.S. foreign policy evolves around Israel and about Jewish power in the United States of America. But what's also interesting to note that, there could be an Israeli hand in this aggression that the United States has directed against Venezuela. And there are a number of reasons, in terms of why Venezuela has been hit, where we know that Venezuela has had or has been developing also a very close relationship with Iran through its negotiations in BRICS. And there are just so many angles that one can actually take a look at. You mentioned earlier on Saddam Hussein, and he threatened at that point in time to move away from the dollar, selling oil in dollar. We know what has happened with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya as well. Similar statements were made. We've heard about Venezuela as well, trying to move away from the dollar. So there's just so much that one can actually unpack in trying to understand what has been playing out, Tarik.
Yeah. Look, I think the first thing is the distinction between that has to be made is the distinction between, I think, Jewish power, as you maybe perhaps termed it, and obviously the Israeli lobby. I think in many cases we've seen Jewish communities come out and actually take very progressive stances. We know in our own liberation struggle as South Africans, white Jewish comrades played a critical role in the Communist Party and so on. But to that extent, I mean, the relationship between Israel as a sort of white supremacist Jewish supremacist state, again separated from the religious grouping of the religious beliefs, has to be, I think, examined and discussed within the understanding that Israel is a settler colonial state. It's no different to apartheid South Africa. It's no different to Australia and New Zealand, and it's no different to the US. I mean, you have a number of settlers who come, in many cases, carry out ethnic cleansing, genocide, and obviously subsequently get rid of the indigenous languages, indigenous cultures. And at that point, we can understand the relationship between the US and the Israelis as a relationship out of necessity, but out of shared characteristics. I mean, we mustn't forget that the US was built on the genocide of indigenous Americans, Native Americans. And so I think then bringing it to the sort of contemporary sense, why then, what is the hand of Israel, or AIPAC as it is in the US, the Israeli lobby within the US, in what's happening in Venezuela? I mean, not to be speculative here, but the fact of the matter is that the US and Israel and traditionally a lot of the European countries, especially those on the far right, do share very, very similar ideological positions when it comes to the relationship with the global south. I think David had mentioned earlier how vastly different the leftist approach that we're seeing in China is to what we had traditionally seen in the colonial and subsequently the neo-colonial positions of the West, you know, to rape and pillage. Whereas what we're seeing now, I think, is you know, the same mentality, the same behavior, and the same ideological postures that exist within the far right that effectively governs Israel exist in the far right that governs the US today. And so even if there may not be a deliberate link, I mean, the modus operandi is exactly the same. You know, the motivating factors between why you know, Europe went and stole from Africa, stole from South America, stole from Asia, and even North America, is exactly persisting within what we're seeing the actions today, right? You mentioned within Gaddafi, you mentioned within Saddam Hussein. I mean, the fact of the matter is that anyone who poses a threat to the American ruling class's hegemonic behavior and actions poses a threat to America, because effectively the country is built around that top 10% as it is, or whatever that number may be. And I think the one point that I want to just conclude on is sort of why the need for necessity, the need for solidarity, the understanding, and I think especially as young South Africans, why we must care about what's happening in Venezuela, and why we must care about what has happened in Iraq, what has happened in Libya, what has happened across our own continent and across the global south, is that it's this idea of shared struggle, right? What's happening in Venezuela can't be the struggle of the Venezuelan people. It has to be the struggle of any peace-loving person across the world, with the understanding that if it can happen to President Nicolas Maduro, there's nothing to stop the US and its imperialist and neo-imperialist behavior from coming onto our continent, or from going into our traditional allies in Cuba, or in the Middle East, or in Russia, or Asia. And I think that's then we must understand that on the ground, what we need to see is young South Africans and young people in general, or people in general actually, taking up the cause, not with the understanding that it's a favor to the Venezuelan people, but it's a duty to anybody who loves peace and justice and equality. So yeah, I hope that I've, you know, captured what I was trying to say and came across quite clearly. Yeah.
Well, it clearly came very, very clearly across, David. And I think just following up from what Tarik is saying again is, you know, looking at the risk that many other countries would face. And you spoke about the global south. And we know the global south obviously makes up a large part of the world's population. And once again, when we see a country like the United States acting with impunity, and it's no hidden secret as well, where even Benjamin Netanyahu, as they dictate American foreign policy, he made it very, very clear that Iran is exporting terrorism to Venezuela. They've been talking about ties between the resistance in Palestine and Venezuela as well. Now, all of this is starting to surface. And again, you know, Tarik raises an important point for us in South Africa. And we are part of BRICS as well. South Africa has been highly critical of Israel, its actions. South Africa has now made the statement in the United Nations with regard to Venezuela as well. You know, what sort of risk, because if Trump gets away with what he did in Venezuela, if he will get away with what he intends to do in Iran, what sort of risks are there for us on the African continent and for us also in South Africa?
Well, I think that in the South African context, we have a significant colonial settler population. And that colonial settler population did not, in 1994, basically meet the rest of the population even a quarter of the way with regard to transformation in this country. The economic wealth is still highly concentrated. The ownership of land and so on is still highly concentrated. And any move that is towards a redistribution and towards establishing equality to address the problems of unemployment and poverty in this country is resisted very violently and very vocally by this population. A large part of this population also has dual citizenship with Israel, and there was a very strong relationship between Israel and South Africa. But I want to come back to Israel and the United States, because what we are seeing in the United States now are pictures emerging that look very similar to the way in which Palestinians are being treated in Palestine by Israel. And this again, just soon after the visit by Netanyahu, we are seeing Trump, who is basically racist. He said he did not want people of color to come to the United States. He said this openly. He would prefer people from Norway and Sweden, people with blonde hair and blue eyes and so on, to come to the United States and so on. And he's basically introduced a system of apartheid pass laws where people are being stopped in the middle of the street, asked where they were born, asked to show their identity documents, and if not, to be kidnapped off the street, from schools, from creches, from hospitals, from wherever they find people. They capture them and drag them off to detention centers and fly them off to a torture camp in Venezuela. So not in Venezuela, in El Salvador. Now, the problem for me is what we are seeing in the United States now is what happened to the Palestinians over the last 40, 50, 60, since 1948, 70 years. We are seeing that kind of fascism being reinterpreted into the United States, where anyone who challenges authority can simply be shot in the street and no questions will be asked. And authority comes in a mask, and authority comes in a uniform. And the only other people who were equally racist to the ICE crowd that is out there now, of course, is the Ku Klux Klan. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some Klan involvement with the Trump administration as well, because it's definitely a matter of white supremacy that is at play there. He wants the oil from Venezuela, but he doesn't want the people. He wants the resources from Central and South America, but he doesn't want the human beings from Central and South America. He doesn't want people from Africa to come to the United States, but he wants to have free access to our minerals and resources. So the risk for me in the South African context is that this racial minority, which is very vocal and extremely noisy and exceptionally racist, is in the process of trying to undermine the government to the point where we can get a regime change scenario similar to that of Iran or Venezuela, which they've tried there, to try and impose or reimpose minority rule in this country, basically white rule, which will give free access to our resources for the Trump administration. You must remember, we've got more than 90% of the world's manganese, which is a critical material in alternative energy and so on. We've got a fair amount of rare earths. We've got a lot of other minerals and materials and so on that the West craves and that they get through the companies and so on that are here. What makes them fear the most is that the majority of the people in the country, like in Venezuela, will take control of the resources and deny them access. And of course, they're afraid that China might get this access, and they're also afraid of de-dollarization and South Africa's role within the BRICS context. And of course, they hate South Africa for taking the case up with the ICJ.
Yes, David. Andreína, what we've seen over a period of time with the United States to provide justification for its actions is to, in the guise of democracy and again, labeling people like Nicolas Maduro as a ruthless dictator. As we've seen, this is their justification for this kidnapping. And just to look at how the people of Venezuela actually view someone like Nicolas Maduro, because we know that there is a lot of history where the former president as well, Hugo Chavez, he sent a very, very clear message that his successor would be Maduro. He was a man who could safeguard the unity of Venezuela, preserve what the country had actually achieved over a period of time. Just what are your thoughts, and what are the thoughts on how do people in Venezuela see Nicolas Maduro? Do they see him as this ruthless dictator as claimed by Donald Trump?
Yes, not at all. The Venezuelan people does not view President Maduro as a dictator, or as they view him as a working class president. Nicolas Maduro used to be a bus driver. He used to be a union fighter. So he's the people, and he has always been one of the people, and people recognize him as such. They recognize him as someone who knows what are the struggles of the working class, because he was working class. And then they see him as someone who took on the responsibility to continue the Bolivarian revolution that Hugo Chavez began in 1998. And he has done so, even though he has been facing unsurmountable
incredible obstacles imposed by the United States. We have to remember that Nicolas Maduro assumed power in 2013, which is when right after Hugo Chavez passed away. And immediately the United States tried to overthrow him. They tried to impose this severe economic sabotage inside the country using the country's oligarchs to try to asphyxiate the Venezuelan economy. And in 2015, the President Barack Obama imposed a decree declaring Venezuela a threat for the U.S. national security. Now, this decree basically made Venezuela toxic for business, which means that Venezuela became a country that most governments or most companies didn't want to invest in because they knew that this decree by Obama meant that the United States was going to impose sanctions eventually. And that's what happened. In 2017, the first Trump administration imposed financial sanctions against Venezuela's state-owned company, PDVSA. And basically, this meant that PDVSA was cut off from the international financial system. It meant that PDVSA couldn't receive payments from the oil sales. It meant that PDVSA couldn't pay its debts with foreign companies. And then in 2019, the same Trump administration imposed an oil embargo, which meant that he was blockading all of the oil exports from Venezuela, which primarily go to China. So that's what happened. And because of the U.S. sanctions, foreign companies that were working in Venezuela, they had to abandon the country. They had to leave all of their oil facilities. That is something that President Nicolas Maduro had to face. He had to face. He has to be governing under incredible challenging circumstances created by the United States. And what we have seen is a president that managed to overcome all of those difficulties. He did it by giving more power to the people. He did it by empowering Venezuelan communes. Venezuela has a communal movement that is basically organized people who take charge of the means of production. They make sure that Venezuela has sovereign food production. And he gave more resources and more power to the people so that we could face these incredible challenging economic circumstances imposed by the United States. And that's how Venezuela has been able to survive despite being blockaded for more than 10 years. So, and that is how the President Maduro is viewed. He's viewed as someone who is working class. He's viewed as someone who is willing to give all the power to the people, to give resources, to give political power to organize communities. He is someone who is viewed as a war president, a president who has been facing war-like situations since the beginning of his mandate. And that's so important that people know that Venezuela has been waging this unilateral war against the United States for more than 10 years in the form of U.S. sanctions, in the form of U.S. blockade, in the form of a naval blockade, and now in the form of an actual military aggression and the kidnapping of President Maduro. So just to sum it up, Nicolas Maduro is not at all viewed as a dictator inside Venezuela.
Yes, Tarik, one word stands out for me, and that is polarization, where we're seeing now featuring very prominently, where you're talking about 15% of the global north dictating to 85% of people that belong to the global south. And this polarization is featuring a lot more prominently. It's blatant, it's open. We see this gap between the rich and poor. We see how the global north imposing on the global south as well. And even in the case of Maduro that we speak about, and also Chavez as well, where they actually try to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor as well. And, as long as this obviously exists, the world, the entire world, and the global south in particular is at risk by the dictates, from the likes of the United States of America and those that support the U.S. agenda globally as well. The key question here is, how does one respond? How do we counter this polarization that is creeping And as David mentioned as well, a minority in this country as well that holds enormous power, that has got control of a large chunk of this country's wealth as well. And we're also at the mercy of this minority.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, I think the first thing that has to be discussed and explored in any discussion about how we protect our sovereignty, how we ensure that we're not dictated to, has to be understanding people's power. You know, we 30 years ago found ourselves at the beginning of a new era in South Africa, and objectively we have made progress. But I think what we need to examine as South Africans first, but then as global citizens, is how do we build. So how do we conscientize, how do we organize, and then how do we mobilize people's power? The reason that I say that is because, quite simply, look, I think the analysis that we have to provide has to be that, in as much as absolutely we're correct in saying that the global north has historically dictated to the global south, even to that extent, we need to go one step further and provide some sort of class analysis where we say that it's the ruling class in the global north that has not only dictated to the working class in their own countries, but in fact the majority of society across the world. And in saying that, I think when we understand that analysis, then the question of people's power is how do we build institutions, how do we build structures within society that are so resilient to the extent that they can face onslaught from the ruling class within the US and subsequently the US military? How do we build institutions within our own society that can weather the storms that are going to be presented to us? And like I said, the task has to be very, very deliberate, and we have to start by, number one, conscientizing our people, the people around us, our citizenry, exposing our masses to an understanding of how society has been built, subsequently to organize people. We have to be able to ensure that people are finding themselves within the spaces where their voices are being heard and where they feel represented. And only through that can we then produce these institutions that are so resilient. And the best example I think that comes to mind, again, looking at, case in point here, is we know, for example, just north of Venezuela, for as long as most of us have been alive, the Cuban people have been facing sanctions from the US, and yet they still understand that their loyalty and their commitment remains to their revolution, to what they achieved when they said they wanted sovereignty and they wanted liberty. And it's that type of ideological resilience that persists, and that's what we need to do in the global south. But like I said, we need to build that solidarity with the understanding that people's power must govern. When we say economic policy, it must be built around how do we benefit the people, people's power. The biggest threat that was posed by Gaddafi to the West, I wouldn't even go so far as to say it's ideological. It's that he again nationalized the oil industry. He used what was available to the people, what belonged to the people, to the benefit of the people. And it's the same thing that we saw in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez and subsequently with President Nicolas Maduro. And that sort of that story is something that's quite persistent throughout history. And that's why I'm saying we need to continue to ensure that we not only continue on the path, but in fact we strengthen the path of building people's power, where our people truly govern our societies.
Yes, David, just to bring you in and just to look at it from a United States perspective now, we know that Donald Trump does not enjoy the popularity of the people on the ground. And we've seen it even with the United States, its support of Israel, the genocide in Gaza, the millions that have actually taken to the streets, voicing their opposition to what has been playing out in Gaza as well. And just to understand, where is Donald Trump leading America to? And let's look at it from the average American's point of view in terms of how they would actually be seeing things that are unfolding as a result of the actions of people like Donald Trump and whoever else is supporting him.
Well, I think the important shift that has taken place most recently is the shift in media power away from corporate media to social media, and the way in which people have used, especially the people in Palestine, have used social media in order to bring their case to the world and also to evoke the sympathy of the world for the terrors that they are suffering. but also more importantly is to expose the lies. The exposure of the lies of the global North started with the lies of Israel around the events of 7th of October, and then then there was a snowballing effect, an avalanche of people beginning to question the narrative that the West tried to impose on the world, not just with regard to Palestine, but even with regard to domestic policy in the United States. And so people in the United States are starting to ask questions, ordinary people. They are starting to ask questions of the oligarchs, and they are starting to develop an intense ill feeling towards the 5 or 6 very rich people who dominate that country, who recently also said they'll put up the money for taking Greenland away from Denmark, for example. So, globally speaking, Donald Trump is actually creating a whole lot of divisions that he did not expect. There's unintended consequences of ill thought out policies by the United States and by Donald Trump, which work to the benefit of people in the global South, because we're now starting to see people in the global North beginning to prepare themselves possibly for a conflict with the United States, or between the United States and Europe. Suddenly Europeans are beginning to realize that the bigger threat to Europe is not Russia, it's actually the United States. The people in South and Central America have known that for the last 70 years. We in Africa know that because we see AFRICON in Africa. The only thing that America ever brings to Africa in terms of development is the establishment of military bases across the continent. No actual development follows their involvement on our continent. And their involvement is all about the attempt to maintain their global dominance. And ordinary Americans and ordinary Europeans and ordinary people all over the world are beginning to realize, but it's not necessary for one country to dominate the world. We can all live in this world together without anyone dominating anyone else, without anyone sticking a gun in the face of anyone else, and more so without a gun being stuck in your face if you're an ordinary American because you are protecting your neighbor from being harassed by the Gestapo, which is what ICE is in the United States. We really have to call out what is happening in that country. And we really have to hope that the people of that country will be able to break free from this duopoly of the Demopublican system, where there are only 2 parties that they ever vote for, and those 2 parties are the shoes of the same body, the left shoe and the right shoe of the body of capitalism that exploits the people of the United States. And people are beginning to realize their own exploitation. Americans are starting to realize that every American does not have the potential to become a billionaire, that the system is a game of monopoly, only very few people will win it, and the vast majority of people will remain exactly where they are, and that they need to rely on one another to survive, that they need to rely on one another to move forward, that they need to rely on one another to live in peace with the rest of the world.
Yes, David, thank you for that. I see we've got about 2 minutes, and just to get Andreína back in, just final thoughts on your side, Andreína. And, a few days ago, it was Venezuela. David spoke about Greenland as well. We're speaking about Iran. Tonight could be Iran as well. It could be any country. But just looking at Venezuela and the support that Venezuela is getting out of South American countries, Latin America as well, because there are talks about the U.S. Proxy control of Venezuela could impact Cuba and its interests as well, to the point where Cuba may even be coerced into subordinating itself to the United States of America.
Yes, so, when the Gaza genocide was happening and we saw it being live streamed into our phone, we were warning that if we allow this to continue, if we allow this genocide to happen in front of everybody and not do anything, especially knowing that it is the United States who is financing and arming the Israeli military, and it is the United States who is providing all the political and financial backup for the genocide to happen. We were warning that if we let that happen, if we don't do something as a global community, if we don't do something to stop it, it was going to happen someplace else. And the United States was going to try to impose its military in other countries, try to occupy and invade other countries in order to do the same, to extract natural resources and try to impoverish the population. And that is what is happening right now in Venezuela. The United States, because we saw how the United Nations and the entire international community didn't do anything to stop the genocide in Gaza, the United States now has done this to Venezuela. It has bombarded the country. It has kidnapped a sitting head of state. That is the result of an international community, a United Nations system that doesn't really do anything to apply international law, to apply the UN Charter. And now we are warning that what happened in Venezuela is going to happen. It might happen to any other country in Latin America. And we saw President Trump threatening to do the same to Colombia. He's trying to push the same narrative that he was pushing against President Maduro about drug trafficking. He's trying to push that same narrative onto President Gustavo Petro to try to do the same, to try to decapitate President Petro and try to impose U.S. interest into Colombia. He's also threatening to collapse in Cuba even more than they have already done it with more than 60 years of blockade. And he's threatening the same to do the same in Mexico. He has threatened to bomb Mexico. So what is happening in Venezuela now, it doesn't just affect Venezuela and the Venezuelan people. It is a concern for every single people in the global South and in South America especially, that the United States is entering a phase in which they're going to try to impose every single U.S. interest that they have into our countries, that they're going to try to impose puppet governments in our countries in order to have easy access to all of our natural resources. And that is the threat that we're facing right now. And that is something that the Venezuelan government and the people have been telling everyone, that if you're going out to the streets to show solidarity with Venezuela, also have in mind that you have to do this in order to stop the United States from continuing to force people into submission anywhere in the world.
Well, Andreína, thank you very much for that. And also to David van Wyk, researcher at Benchmark Foundation, Tarik Lalla, South African students leader, youth policy advocate, and Venezuelan journalist, Andreína Chávez. We thank you all. We do appreciate you taking time out for us right here on Salam Media. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good night, everyone.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Wednesday Nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, and an important discussion, a critical discussion to be had, and also, I think, more importantly, in terms of unpacking and debunking this myth of the United States of America, the policeman playing the role of the policeman of the world, and the whole question surrounding labeling people like Nicolas Maduro as brutal dictators, the whole question surrounding the narcotics charges that have been leveled against him and his wife as well. And we will continue following up the debate, but also I think something that we need to be aware of at this point in time, that possibly an attack on Iran could also be imminent as well. So let us not be surprised, particularly when one looks at Donald Trump and his presidency, and this is a legacy, and calling himself the peace president, obviously laughable. The FIFA Peace Award that was granted to him as well, another joke as well, because the worst of the worst at this point in time in terms of leadership right across the entire world has been Donald Trump, but also to understand who is behind Donald Trump, what lies behind Donald Trump, and also the greater agenda. And for us at South Africa as well, and also people on the African continent, the global South in general as well, one needs to be aware of these dynamics that are playing out on the or in the global political landscape. And with that, I'm going to be signing off once again. It's been an absolute pleasure being in the company of our listeners. It's great to be back with you once again. So until we meet, from myself in the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.